Welcome and thank you for joining our March 1st Tuesday with Dave Moskowitz. My name is Daniel Senner and I am the Conservation Project Manager for the Met Howe Conservancy. For those of you who don't know, the Met Howe Conservancy is a nonprofit land trust and community conservation organization whose mission is to inspire people to care for the land of the Met Howe Valley. I would like to start this evening off with a land acknowledgement and an introduction. First, I would like to acknowledge that the Met Howe Conservancy, as a land trust and environmental organization, we seek to protect and steward the land that for time immemorial was cared for by members of the Met Howe tribe. This is their homeland. We recognize that we must do more to build better relationships and acknowledge our past with our Met Howe tribe descendants who still live and care for the land in this valley. Now, on a different note, I think my favorite bird nesting strategy, as you can see by the picture behind me, are cavity nesters. To me, it's amazing that everything from a great horned owl, a wood duck, a mountain bluebird, a chickadee, all utilize tree holes to safely raise their families. It can be fun to imagine each of these species shopping the forest or wooded draw for just the perfect tree to build or occupy a cavity in. In some of the better snag real estate in the valley, I can picture there being almost an apartment-like neighborhood with each unit furnished to that species' specific taste. And although I have always been curious what kind of nest decorations a kestrel might prefer with their ability to see ultraviolet light, I have never had the knowledge or opportunity to answer those questions for myself. But that is why I'm so excited that our speaker tonight and his fellow co-authors recently put out a new Peterson Field Guide to the bird nests of North America to help answer my questions about bird nests. So here to share insights and experiences from the creation of this guide is none other than Dave Moskowitz. Welcome, Dave.
Awesome. Thanks. Great to be here with you guys. I always love doing events with the Conservancy, and excited to talk about bird nests tonight. So I will say that this is actually the first presentation I've done since the book was published. You know, it came out in the middle of COVID restrictions and all that. And I've got two co-authors on it, Casey McFarland and Matthew Mongello. And they've done a few events, but this will be the first time with me. So thanks for your patience as I work my way through a set of slides that Casey originally developed, and then I kind of adapted for tonight for this audience. So yeah, but looking forward to sharing what I can about, you know, kind of my experience with bird nests and identifying them and what that tells us about birds. And let me just start by sharing there. Daniel, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's actually not here's the start of my slideshow. Okay. Yeah, so I think the first thing I want to share actually is that my primary relationship with wildlife is not with birds. Like, I'm definitely not an ornithologist. I'm not even like a great birder. Like, I'm decent, but I'm sure there's many people on this call that are way better at birding than I am. And actually, I've gotten to the point now where I might have an easier time identifying a bird from its nest than the actual bird itself in some instances, where like I could see the nest and have a guess at what it is, but if I saw the bird, I might be kind of lost. So it's kind of an odd set of knowledge, you know, for me, but it comes from my background as a wildlife tracker. And so, you know, a lot of my work and, you know, just what I love to do is go out and learn about the stories that animals leave on the landscape from the tracks and signs they leave behind. And bird nests are one of the most fascinating signs that wild animals leave on the landscape. And they're so incredibly complex and diverse. And this project of writing this field guide, and there's the cover of the book, which you can pick up at Trails End Bookstore if you want. And there's my two co-authors at the Western Museum of Vertebrate Zoology in Southern California, which has an amazing collection of nests. But the reason that I actually tried to get Matt, here, this is Matt right here, to write this field guide so that I could have a copy, because I wanted a really good field guide to identify bird nests, and because I'd find them and I wouldn't be able to figure out what they were, and the resources that were available were fairly limited in my sense of things. So he said, well, I'll work on this project if you'll help. And then I was like, okay. And then Casey McFarland, who's a colleague of mine, jumped in as well. And this is actually Casey's second obscure book about birds. His first book was a field guide to bird feathers. So, we're working our way around the edges with birds. But anyhow, that's a little background for this. So I'm not claiming, even after completing this book, which is a comprehensive guide to bird nests across North America, I'm not claiming to be an expert on every species. There's a lot of things that are in this guide that I have to look up, as I've already demonstrated once while we're getting ready for this. So I'll do my best to answer questions, and probably in the process of what I'm going to share tonight, I will hopefully encourage you to start asking more questions about bird nests and open up a window to exploring the fascinating world that bird nests really offer. This cedar waxwing I took this actually off my front porch here in the Metro a few years ago. And, the opportunity to watch birds when they're nesting is really amazing when it happens. But, once the nesting season's done, those nests remain, and they have stories to tell us about the wild animals that we share the world with. And really my interest in bird nests came primarily out of this, like finding nests that were not in season, that weren't being used by birds, and just wondering about the bird that made it, and the life history that led to, the creation of this amazing shelter, right? And so my goal tonight will be to share a little bit about the evolution of how come there are bird nests in the world, right? It's pretty amazing, actually. And then to give you guys a little bit of kind of like a systematic way of looking at nests. And so I'm not promising at the end of this, you'll be able to go out and identify every nest that you find on the landscape. I'm actually guaranteeing you won't be able to do that. I don't know anybody that can do that. I'll talk about that a bit towards the end in terms of what we can identify and what we can't and all that stuff. But I am hoping that when you see a nest, you'll have a lens to look at it that'll help you narrow down who the nest maker might have been, and then just appreciate the way this bird is interacting with the landscape, and really appreciate just the tremendous diversity and complexity of the behavior that's nesting for birds. And I'm definitely going to talk a bit about ethics and conservation. This was a big question when we decided to tackle this book, because obviously the nesting season for birds and bird nests, when they're in use, is one of the most sensitive times in the year for birds, and very critical for their survival as individual species and as a class of animals. So I'll definitely chat a little bit about that. You will see some photos of bird nests with eggs in them, and I'll talk a little bit about that towards the end in terms of the appropriateness or inappropriateness of approaching nests that are actively being used. The other reason that we wrote this book was hopefully to provide a guide for researchers that are doing bird, reproduction surveys and things like that. So, and oftentimes net eggs may be the only way you can definitively identify a nest, but going out and searching for nests when the birds are actually using them is a complicated, decision to make, and often not the best one. So we'll talk a little bit about that at the end of the slideshow. So, and I want to mention one other person. There's another photo of Emily Gibson. She's actually got her name on the inside cover of the book as a contributor as well. She was my inspiration for learning about bird nests, and she is just magical in terms of finding nests. She told me that when she was a little girl, she would take a 10-foot tall ladder and walk around in the woods in her hunt for bird nests. And something stuck there because she just finds nests like nobody else. And she was instrumental in helping make this book happen, and certainly my mentor when it comes to bird nests. So just want to recognize her. There's about 10,000 species of birds in the world, which I find staggering to believe. And they all engage in some sort of nesting behavior or ritual. More than half of those birds are passerines, songbirds. And every species of bird does something to prepare an area to receive eggs. And it's actually, in large part, the fact that birds have developed this behavior of building nests that has allowed them to be so successful and occupied just about every type of environment on terrestrial environment on planet Earth. Because they couldn't survive, their young wouldn't be able to survive. They wouldn't be able to produce young in places like the tundra or mountaintops or, wind-blown offshore islands or rainforest without the ability to create these safe havens for their young. So it's really allowed them to diversify and occupy all these different ecological niches all over the planet. So here's just a few of the variety of different nest feature, that you'll find out on the landscape. So just talking a little bit about where this, the origins of the nest building behavior. This dinosaurs laid eggs and produced nests. Some of those nests were like modern reptiles, so maybe a sandy where the dinosaur would bury their eggs in a sandy scrape and then probably just abandon them, and then they would just hatch and just go live their lives, hopefully. Others of them buried them in a mound. So like a crocodile buries their eggs in a mound today. Sea turtles do it in like a scrape and bury it on the beach, something like that. But this particular illustration, which is a drawing out of the book by Mark Hango Higgins, is of an oviraptor, which is a type of dinosaur. And this is a reproduction of a fossilized nest of an oviraptor. And actually the fossilized, it wasn't just the nest with the eggs in it, it was actually the animal crouched over the nest. So possibly brooding this this nest. And the fact that these eggs are laid out very systematically suggests that they were being tended to in the same way that modern birds tend to eggs in their nest, and they'll roll them over and move them around to make sure they're being appropriately heated or not too hot as the nesting season goes on. So it's likely that from this very basic behavior of like a basic scrape to accommodate these eggs and literally keep them from rolling away and creating a little bit of shelter for them, all these other types of nest structures evolved. Birds started figuring out that if they did a little bit more construction, that they might get something that's even more successful. So I just want to walk through, the basic, we went through a number of folks have come up with different ways to classify nests. The reality of it is, we have 650 species of breeding birds in North America, and there's 650 different ways to make a nest or, raise young. And even more than that, because you'll see some bird species do a variety of different things. But this is our attempt to break down, based on other people's, classification systems, a simple way to think about nests. And really for me, one of the first things I look at when I'm looking at a nest to try to interpret who did it, who made it, is it a scrape in the ground? Is it a simple platform? Is it a cavity? Cavities are one of the most successful types of nests. You'll actually find that there's a number of studies that show that the survival rate of nests built in cavities is higher than any other type of nest. You've got your classic cup nests, which I think that most folks think about when they think about a bird nest. You've got pendulous nests that hang down. This is definitely a much more advanced evolutionary structure. We'll talk a little bit about that. You've got covered or enclosed nests that are like globular. They're like a globe. And then the bird goes inside of it. So, and then you also have birds that are using burrows in the ground of some sort. So that's the first, kind of line of discrimination in terms of these different features. And the passerine nests, the cup nests and the pendulous nests and these dome nests that they built, these more elaborate structures, are definitely a later evolutionary adaptation of what was originally just a simple scrape in the ground, most likely. And the fact that passerines are one of the most successful types of birds on the planet probably also speaks to the fact that these nest structures are so successful and allows them to reproduce in all these different niche habitats. So here's a sandpiper nest and a spotted sandpiper nest. You can see this is your classic scrape nest. It's just, there's a little bit of, vegetation, they've just pushed a little bit of the gravel out of the way, and they might add a little bit of, soft material, in this case, a few wood chips, or maybe not. And then they lay their eggs and then they sit on them. So this is the most simple. And when those eggs are gone, you never know there's a nest there for sandpiper often. Sometimes with gulls, there's a little bit more of a scrape and a little bit more material there, but just a very simple scrape. And like I said, one of the most basic ways that nests exist. Here's a platform nest. So this takes some construction. You'll put materials together in a loose kind of way. It's kind of built up to a certain degree, and there may be a small depression in the middle of it, and then you lay your eggs in it. This is a coot nest, and coots build their platforms in emergent vegetation. So that's bulrushes there, and they're actually floating often. So I'm calling, this is a step up in the complexity of these nests, but already pretty complex. To build a floating home is pretty impressive. Some platform nests are in trees, others are on the ground, but a basic platform. Here's a white-headed woodpecker from eastern Okanagan County. And this is a great example of a cavity nest. Besides woodpeckers, there's a few other birds that will also build their own cavities. And then there's tons of birds that will use pre-existing cavities, either natural or those made by woodpeckers or nest boxes, as the case may be. So pretty self-explanatory how those work. And then there's some birds that nest in burrows, as I mentioned. This is a kingfisher, the entrance to a kingfisher nest, and they can go in about 1 meter or more. And then there's a number of seabirds, alcids, so like auklets and puffins and things like that, that will construct, they'll actually excavate nests into the earth and lay their eggs in the back of them. A lot of work to do that as well. Others will use natural cavities on the ground. So you'll find rocks that are kind of overhanging, and they'll just crawl back in there and lay their egg. Let's see what else we've got here. Then we've got our getting into what, again, most folks think about when you think of a bird nest. You probably imagine a nest like this, which is a cup. And it's called a cup nest because it looks like a cup. You could fill it with water and drink out of it. And there's a wide variety of cup nests, but just this basic structure of materials carefully woven into a cup shape. And we'll talk a little bit about how they do that and the layers and that in just a moment, but that's your classic cup nest. This is a varied thrush nest, and from the west side of the Cascades. I mentioned there's these pendulous nests. So this is taking the cup nest and even going a little bit more extreme into it. So these nests are attached at the top to typically to a tree branch, and then they hang down. And then these birds need to go to a lot of trouble to weave and build a structure that hangs together and allows the eggs they can go into the top of it, and then they'll lay their eggs in the bottom. And then amazingly enough, the nest can grow as the more eggs are added, and then as the young inside of it grow, they kind of swell. And we'll talk a little bit about how they do that. But here's a bush tit nest, and these tiny little birds, they're literally like, a golf ball and a half, and they build a nest that hangs down, 8 or 10 inches or 12 inches. So much bigger than they are. And they'll often have helpers that not just the male and female will build the nest. There may be other helper birds that help construct that nest pretty amazingly. The bird on the left is a Bullock's oriole, and that one's from here in the Methow Valley. I mentioned the domed nest. So this is a variation on the cup nest. So there's actually a cup in the bottom, and then they've built a dome over the top of it. So they've basically put a roof on their cup nest. This is an ovenbird from the southeastern US. And this one is often referred to as a globular nest, pretty similar to a dome in some ways. This was one that probably a number of folks here in the Methow would recognize. This is a magpie nest. And again, there's got two parts. There's the bottom, and then the top. It's almost like built this roof. Sometimes it'll look like it all comes together into one big globular mess of sticks. Amazingly enough, though, when you look inside of that, you'll find a cup nest built in the middle of it. So they've built this big structure around it. And one of the things that this nest here will do probably is keep larger birds out. And that might be something magpies are very invested in, because nest robbing, like hunting for other birds' eggs, is something that many birds do, but magpies in particular are voracious egg eaters. So they may be trying to prevent some karmic payback there with the nest structures that they build. So that's just a introduction to a few different structures that you'll find in bird nests. I want to take a moment and just break it down a little bit more, because once you look at the structure of a nest, the basic structure, like, is it a cup nest? Is it a globular nest? Is it, whatever the case may be, a scrape? Then you're going to want to take a closer look and look at the materials that are in it and how they're put together, because different birds will build similar looking nests from the outside, but when you start deconstructing them, then you'll see that there's there's variations in the types of materials they use and how they put them together. And this here is a robin nest. And robin nests are one of the most common nests for people to find on the landscape for several reasons. One is that robins are a very common bird. Another is that they tend to build their nests about head height. So when you're walking around in the world, you tend to see them because they're right at head height. And then the other reason is because they last a long time on the environment, because they build a really strong, sturdy nest, which has a thick layer of mud in the middle of it. That gives it a lot of cohesion. So months or even years later, even though the robin's only using the nest once, that nest will persist on the landscape. So for those reasons, we see a lot of them. And here you can see an outer layer of sticks and moss, and then this mud, and then an inner layer of fine grasses, which is what they actually lay their eggs in, that soft cushioning bit. And many, many cup nests have this similar structure of like a coarser, rougher build on the outside that creates like kind of the exoskeleton. And then on the inside, a much finer material where they actually lay their eggs. Here's a look at Casey found a actively being built robin nest and snuck in and grabbed a quick photo of it in progress. So here the robin is just coming and adding beakful and beakful after beakful of mud to build that inner wall before it eventually lines it with that finer inner layer. And just another look of an old robin nest being taken apart to get a better sense of that. This is the inner cup removed, and you can see that mud layer and then the outer layer as well. So when you're thinking about nests, you want to think about those different layers of the nest and what it's being built out of, how they're put together, the materials they're using are all interesting things that might be important to help you understand who made the nest, or if you know who made the nest, just learn more about how they see the world, right? Robins have a good eye for mud, right? They're on the lookout for mud because that's an important part of their nest. Another interesting thing you'll see in the layers of a nest, this is a blue-gray gnatcatcher, and you can see this was taken with a telephoto lens from below it. Here's the gnatcatcher sitting on its nest, but it's decorated the nest with lichens, right? These little lichens, these are all carefully placed around the outside of it. And a number of birds will decorate their nests. And it's not 100% understood why they do that, or if all birds do it for the same reason. But that's another really interesting feature that I find fascinating, and could be a good distinction. There's a number of birds that build nests that look very similar to gnatcatchers. Some of them don't. And some gnatcatchers will do it, others will not. So there you go. Pretty fascinating, if you ask me. Hummingbirds do that as well. You can see this is a hummingbird nest, and you can see the decorations there, and all the spider silk that they use to build this nest is also really cool. Here's a top-down view of that same nest. And one of the things about hummingbirds, as we know, is that they have a really fast metabolism, and which means that they need to feed quite often. We think about that they need to feed, but it also means that they build nests with a lot of insulation to keep them and their eggs warm, right? Because they have to incubate those eggs, so they need to sit on there, and if they're losing heat really quickly, that's going to be a problem for them. So hummingbirds build these really well insulated nests. So just for a scale, that nest would be between a quarter and a silver dollar sized structure, depending on the bird. So coming back to that first image that I put up, with the title of the show here, this is from the Museum of Vertebrate Zoology. This is a loggerhead shrike nest. And maybe now you can return to this and see, again, a little bit more than you did in that first. You can see that outer layer of sticks, and then a finer inner layer that builds that inner cup for insulation and then protection. And we'll return a little bit more to nests like this that have lots of sticks on the outside and then finer material on the inside, because good example of how different birds from different groups of birds build nests that are quite similar. As I mentioned a little bit already, but I just want to take another just talk about a little bit more, is the actual specific materials that birds are using. I think Orioles, this is an Oriole nest, are a great example of this, where you really learn a bit about the world that this animal lives in by what the nest is constructed out of. I found Oriole nests that were built with nothing but fishing line on the banks of the Columbia River. You'll find baling wire or baling twine in there, all sorts of human materials. And obviously there's a lot of stuff that humans produce, which is great for weaving. So Orioles take advantage of that instead of using just grasses or things like that. But you'll see birds some birds need very specific things. They will only make their nest out of one type of material. Other birds are much more adaptable. So this is a yellow warbler nest. And this nest was constructed by a trail where people walk their dogs all the time. And the nest was lined with dog hair. Yellow warblers don't need dog hair to build a nest, but that's what they have. I looked at a Say's Phoebe nest at my friend Emily's house a couple of years ago, and her daughter has sled dogs, and the Say's Phoebe nest was just bristling with dog hair because that was available. So the materials can be very specific, or they can be, adaptable to what's in the environment. Probably one of the most interesting as far as materials here that I think about is our cliff swallows. So only about 5% of the birds in the world use mud, and even a much tinier number use exclusively mud. But our cliff swallows, which we have here in the Northwest, are one of those birds. It can take them 2,500 trips to construct a single nest. You can imagine each one of these is a single trip to go get a little bit of mud and then plop it in there. And then when cliff swallows apply the mud to their nest, they quiver their head in this really specific way, which vibrates the mud, kind of like you'd put a vibrator into cement to get it to settle and adhere to each other as you're adding it. So they have this very specific behavior that they do to construct this very elaborate nest. They're basically making their own cavity nest for their, to raise their young in, and they'll do it colonially often as well. So just fascinating example. And here's the sign, right? So each one of those beak is a beak full of mud. 2,500 trips of collecting a beak full of mud for a tiny little bird to construct this nest much bigger than them. So a huge amount of energy outlay for passerines, especially to produce these nests, but such an critical part of the survival of their species that it makes it worth it to do that. This is actually a relative of the cliff swallow. This is a barn swallow nest. And this I found in a barn. It was not the nesting season, but there's 2 eggs that hadn't hatched left in it, which occasionally you'll find. You'll just find abandoned eggs that had failed for whatever reason. But a number of swallows will line their nest with feathers, either their own. Some birds will use down feathers from their own breast, and others will just collect feathers from the landscape and incorporate that into their nest as well. And that can be a very predictable part of the lining of the nest for certain species. So a good thing to key into. Just wanted to come back to that bush tit nest, and as we're talking about materials, and just take a closer look at, this is a close-up macro look at the side of a bush tit nest, and it's loaded with spider egg sacs and spider silk. There can be hundreds of spider egg sacs in a single nest. And they'll also find plant fibers that have hooks in them. Certain plants have, they kind of have like natural Velcro. And so they'll use spider silk and these Velcro-like plants to weave in together to make something that's literally, kind of cohesive, and then can even expand as needed. Another thing you're going to want to pay attention to when you find a nest is where it's located, right? And as I mentioned, birds build nests everywhere, and tops of trees. They can build them out on the edge of the tree. They could build them, hanging from a branch out at the tips. They can build it close to the trunk, right? It could be in a bush, at the base of the bush, in a grass clump, on a grass clump. The very specific micro feature where this nest is constructed is an important clue to who made it. Some birds are really adaptable and can build them in a wide variety of places. Other birds are really consistent. Like, you will only find their nests on the ground, or you will only find them in the tops of a tree, or you will only find them next to the trunk of the tree, built underneath underneath a branch, right? So these are all very specific. They have these very specific structure ways that they, or places they want to build their nests. And that could be, this is a great example. You have some nests that are surrounded by water, where the nest is built up from under the water all the way up, others that are floating. And so that's, this is true not just of terrestrial nests, but also for even aquatic nests as well. So that's another piece that I'm thinking about as I approach trying to interpret or identify a nest. And I'll weave that all together, no pun intended, with my knowledge about what sort of birds are in the area to try to sort out whose nest it might be. That ecological knowledge or that bird list, knowing who could be there is critical for that. So just I want to talk a bit about how these nests are attached, right? So this is yet another thing that you want to pay attention to. It's like, what's the structure of the nest? Where is the nest? What's the nest constructed out of? And then how is it attached to, is it just sitting on the ground? Is it sitting on top of a branch? Is it nested in the crotch of a tree or branches? Or in this case, classic vireo nest, there's a Cason's vireo nest. They actually hang the nest down and they've suspended it from the crotch of, two branches split, and they will very consistently build their nest, wrapping the top of it around those branches, and then it hangs down below it. And around here, as soon as I see that, I'm like, probably vireo. And an amazing construction project there. This is a grackle nest, which we don't have around here to the best of my knowledge. But we do have birds just that build a very similar nest to them. This is a red-winged blackbird nest. And both of these types of birds actually very carefully weave their nests. So they actually, amazingly enough, use a similar type of knot to weave their nests that weaver birds in Africa use, even though they're not necessarily they're not related. But they'll use fine materials to actually weave their nest into, in this case, emergent vegetation coming out of a wetland. As I mentioned, here's a, so this one's built into the crotch of a tree. This is a black-tailed gnatcatcher, a different type of gnatcatcher than the one I showed previously, but both of them are built where it's sitting down into the crotch of a tree. Notice this one doesn't have any of those decorations. Different species doesn't do it. Here's a mourning dove nest. It's a platform nest built out of loosely put together sticks, and it's just sitting essentially on top of branches in the tree, right? So it's just, maybe a little bit woven in, but much less finely constructed. Here's a rock wren nest, and they will actually use rocks to build the front of their nest. They'll build a cup inside of that, and they'll do it inside of a rock enclosure there. So they're kind of modifying their cavity to make it harder for other birds to get into in this particular instance. So there's a whirlwind tour through, kind of examples of all the different things to think about when you're finding a bird nest. So I know that it can be pretty challenging. Sometimes you find a bird nest and you know exactly what it is. You're like, oh, dang, there's a vireo nest. That's great, blah, blah, blah. There's 3 species of vireos around here, so I don't know which species it is, but I'll look in the book and decide that this habitat's better for that one. So I think it's that type of vireo. Great. Or maybe it's a robin nest. You find that big nest with the mud in it, and you're super excited. Everything fits. You're like, great, it's a robin nest. But sometimes you'll find the haggard old nest. Sticks, it's a bird nest. You got an idea what you think it might be, maybe, but you know what? You just may never know. And one of the things that you want to get comfortable with is that some things are just going to be ambiguous, and that's okay. And I've spent time with, amazing birders and ornithologists and folks that have done, breeding behavior research on birds, and nobody knows how to identify every nest out there out of season. So just be comfortable with that and approach each nest, as having something to teach you. Maybe it will be who made it. Maybe it'll be something else about the environment. So getting comfortable with the ambiguous is great. Definitely starting with those easier nests, know what you can know and know those things, right? And then know what you may have a hard time knowing and be comfortable with that. So, do some research on the birds in the area where you're living or working or playing, and then the ones that are easier to identify will start popping out. It's amazing once you look at a bush tit nest once. You'll just walk out on the landscape one day where there's bush tits and be like, there's a bush tit nest. So that's great. As for actually finding nests, when I'm walking through the woods, and I do this for all sorts of tracks and sign, not just bird nests, I'm always looking for something that doesn't quite fit, right? So the visual flow of a tree, is kind of a certain way, and then there'll be a glob in the middle of it. So as far as finding nests out of season, I just always keep my eyes open for something that just doesn't quite fit. And certainly if there's a hole in a tree, I always want to go and peer into it. And if at all possible, but yeah, just keeping an eye out for things that don't quite fit. And like I said, just remembering that, and I think this is true of birding in general, like identifying who the bird is really, it's fascinating for sure. Making a list of species you've seen in a day can be a lot of fun. I do it occasionally, often with not a great deal of success because I'm not a great birder, but there's a lot more to learn than just the name of a bird. And the same thing can be said for the nest as well. These things have something to teach us about the lives these birds are living. So just to share that, I think I mentioned this. Here's another example of a vireo nest. This is a Plumbeus vireo, not one you find around here, but same structure. This is a great example of a relatively easy to identify nest because it's so distinctive. So there are other pendulous nests here. This one's enclosed. This is a different example of an oriole nest. So these enclosed or pendulous nests are often a great one to start working on identifying. The wren family is a great family to key into because they all make some sort of globular enclosed nest. But the specifics of it are really unique to the particular species. So your house wrens will do it out of sticks and they'll stuff it into the eaves of your house or a natural cavity. The rock wren builds it in the rocks. And I bet you could guess what sort of wren this is. It's a cactus wren. That's right. No surprises there. Same structure. If you think about that marsh wren that at the start of the, I'll go back real quick. At the start of the slideshow, was this one. Here's the marsh wren built in a marsh out of marsh plants. Same structure essentially, right? But so wrens are a great one to learn about, figure out what wrens you've got in your area, and then have at it. Here's another example of a marsh wren actually as well. So you can see very similar structure, but the materials and the location are adapted to the particulars of that species. So yeah, it's a good example of an easier set of birds to start with. There's Emily again. This was a nest we found in the spring, like right as the snow was melting. So before nesting season had gotten underway on the road up to Hart's Pass, found this haggard old nest. And you can see it's got this outer stick lining with the inner lining and of finer materials for insulation. And our best guess was that was probably a gray jay, Canada jay, possibly a Clark's nutcracker, just because of where we found it, the habitat it was in, and then that basic structural description of it. But ultimately we didn't know for sure. But a lot of corvids will build nests like that. You can see this is a Woodhouse's scrub jay with that outer sticky layer and then the inner cup of finer material. The earlier nest I showed you that was very similar was a shrike. Here's a curve-billed thrasher's nest in a cactus. And you can see that very similar structure. So in this particular case, the structure by itself is going to be, this is a much harder, maybe you can narrow it down to a few birds, but without eggs or some other really specific kind of habitat feature that's specific for a certain species, you might have a hard time getting it down beyond, it's one of these three types of birds. Here's a mockingbird. I don't know why this, I think hopefully this photo will clear up. But mockingbird in the mimid family with thrashers. They build a similar stick nest with an inner cup lining. And then Yeah, so actually before I move on here, there's this again, just to give you a warning there that just beware, you will find things that you will have a hard time sorting out. And then the other thing to mention is here's a catbird from Alabama. And in the deciduous forest built with, deciduous leaves and all that, sticky outside, sticks on the outside, finer material on the inside. And then less than half a mile away, here's another catbird nest, right? So it looks actually pretty different. This one's like all neat and tidy and so forth. And this one just looks like, this one's more similar to what I've seen of catbird nests around here. It looks like it's falling apart even as it's built and being used. They're kind of loose and going in every different direction, but even the same species can have some variety to them. Anyhow, once you get through all of the simple ones and the kind of difficult ones, then if you really are ready to make yourself really frustrated, then you might want to jump into the grass cup nests, and in particular sparrows. So we beat our heads against a wall for a long time to try to figure out how to help people sort out sparrow nests. And we looked at hundreds of photos of sparrow nests that we had taken and that other people had taken, just trying to get a gestalt of what they look like. And so many sparrows just have this really finely built grass cup that's maybe built into the ground, maybe slightly off the ground. But we came up with this chart where we broke down which types of sparrows will nest on the ground or in a shrub or in a tree. And then a little bit about the habitat and then a little bit about the eggs. And so basically this was our attempt to help folks if they found a nest that could be a sparrow, break it down. You'll see most of that has nothing to do with the nest. It has to do with the ecological context in which you find it. And that's just the reality of the situation. So that being said, don't despair. If you find a nest that you don't know what it is, just work with what you've got. Really focus in on just those basic observations I talked about. Hopefully now, as you're looking at this nest here, which again, I found with Emily Gibson while we were out in the field poking around here in the Methow. Hopefully you're looking at me like, oh, look, it's built into the crotch of a shrub. It's a few feet off the ground. It's got it's about this big. It's got a nice, looking at the materials it's made out of. Hopefully I've started to give you a few things that you can start classifying these nests a little bit. Our best guess was that this was McGillivrary's warbler, just based on the fact that McGillivrary's warblers like to nest at about that height in shrubs and that sort of habitat, and build a nest that roughly looks like that. And there wasn't another bird that we could think of that would do something quite exactly like that. So could be wrong, but that was our best evaluation of that from seeing it. Maybe somebody on this call will be able to point out something that we missed. I wouldn't be surprised. I want to just wrap up here with a brief just conversation about ethics and conservation. And it is so fun to watch birds. Like, birds are just amazing, charismatic species, and watching birds go through their nesting cycle, when we can do that in a way that's respectful to the birds and not disturbing them, it's so wonderful. When I had those cedar waxwings literally out my front door, it was just amazing, right? The birds were fine with, they actually, I think, liked us there. We were protection for them to some degree, but I gave them their space. But that's wonderful when those beautiful moments happen. But one thing we definitely want to avoid doing is going out and just searching for nests during the breeding season, right? You can use your knowledge of birds and bird behavior to find nests. Often what I will do though is if I'm in an area and like I see behavior that's telling me like, oh, I think these birds are nesting around here. I'll bookmark that. I might stand off in the distance and watch them for a while to see if I can narrow down what's going on and if they're, where that nest might be. And then I'll just bookmark that and come back in a couple months or a month later, and just see if they're still there. A month later, maybe they're finishing up their nesting season, but I'll come back if I want to check out what that nest is and then key into finding it after they're done with it. So if one way you can use the active breeding behavior of birds to learn about nests without disturbing them is do exactly that. Just to take a GPS coordinate or just make a mental note and come back and find it after that they're done with it. So you got opportunities to observe nests from a distance, and then really focus on when the leaves are off the ground. Right now is a great time of year as the snow's melting and all the leaves are off the bushes. I find more nests just out wandering around the woods right now than I do at a lot of other times of the year. So this fall and winter and spring before the leaves blow up and the birds get really after it is a great time of year to be looking for nests. And then the other piece is like a proactive, like part of ethics and the conservation of birds is us not disturbing those birds. But the other piece is really using our knowledge of where birds are nesting by observing their nests to know that these are vital pieces of habitat for birds. And birds collectively are in big trouble on our planet, and protecting their habitat for nesting is a critical part of that. So hopefully in the process of learning about these birds and their nests, that will help us make better decisions about advocating for places to conserve and protect, and keep your dogs and cats out of in the spring when you realize that there's birds nesting in a particular area, things like that. So yeah, I think that's really what I've got to share. I'm looking forward to answering some questions. Here's another photo from here in the Methow Valley. This is a buried thrush nest found again with Emily Gibson. And just to give you a sense of, I guess, kind of a little bit of an ethics piece, but I actually climbed an adjacent tree to this active nest and climbed up a ways with that, and then used a camera on the end of a 10-foot pole that I held up with like a bit of a telephoto to photograph this nest from a distance. So I never got anywhere close to it, but gave us, because these guys nest up in the tops of trees, they're often 20 meters up in a tree. So you don't often get a view like that looking down into them. So yeah, just I love bird nests, and hopefully I've shared a little bit about why I love them and gave you some things to think about in terms of if you find a bird nest out in the world. And with that, I think I'll stop sharing my screen and take some questions if there are any.
Awesome. Thanks, Dave. That was really fascinating. Already got a couple questions here in the chat box. If you're ready, I'll start with one.
Hold on 1 second.
Yeah.
I'm trying to figure out how to stop sharing my screen. Sorry. Oh, there we go. Somebody else just started sharing their screen. Not me.
There we go.
Perfect. Go for it.
Cool. So Robin asks, do you have any advice about collecting nests when they're not being used? Does your book say which species are likely to reuse their nests year after year, or should the general rule be to just leave them in place?
Yeah, actually there's most passerines. So most of the nests, most folks don't want to collect a seagull nest, which is a pile of like it's nothing. It's just a depression in the ground. I don't know what there'd be to collect except some seaweed maybe, but people that are talking about collecting nests are probably thinking about passerine nests because they're small and containable. And most passerines do not reuse their nest. Like I'm trying to think about an example of a bird that does reuse their nest. I mean, passerines will use them once, even if they have double clutches in a year, they'll typically make another nest. And so actually some birds will make multiple nests. So marsh wrens, the males will make 3 or 4 or 5 nests, and the female will go and look and she's like, no, oh, I like this one, right? And that could be selection, and it also could be dummy nests to throw off predators. So I guess all that to say is that if you find a nest out of season for most, if not all, perching birds, collecting it is probably a pretty safe bet. Yeah, if you want to do that, to share for, they're great naturalist objects, have a lot to teach. Typically, if you find a nest out of season, it looks a little weathered, and you can just tell that this thing's not, going to be used again. So,
Dave, you
and
touched.
I stand corrected. If anybody knows something different than me about that, please feel free to chime in about that. But that's my off the cuff statement about that.
Dave, you touched on something interesting there. Is it the male that's usually building the nest?
That depends on the species. So in some species, the males do all the construction and the females come and check it out. Many species, the males and females do it together. I'm trying to think about off the cuff if there's some where just the females do it. There may be, but I'm not remembering a particular species in North America where that's the case. But it's often shared, sometimes just the males. Sometimes the female will build and the male will collect materials for her to build. Yep.
Okay. Another follow-up question from Wendy. Do you have any idea why birds don't reuse their nests? Is it about hygiene or something else?
That's a good question. Yeah. There's probably a variety of things. Keeping a lot of birds work really hard to keep their nest surreptitious, so it can't be found, and they carry off the fecal material of the nestlings so that that's not dropping below the nest. Not all birds do that, but they'll try to keep it hidden. So yeah, potentially after being used once, it's kind of like they figure their cover's blown and they might want to go somewhere else. If you find, this is another interesting thing, which I didn't talk about, when you find an old nest, you can tell if it was likely a successful nest or not, because if it was successful, a little tight cup nest that starts like this, if the nestlings lived until they were fledglings, it'll get pushed and pushed out as they get bigger and then flattened out as they're just standing on top of it before they fly off. And so at that point, a nest like that would have to be reconstructed anyways. And some of it may be just they're hardwired to do it, and there could be a wide variety of reasons for that the bird doesn't even really know about, and maybe humans would have a hard time ascertaining.
Dave, what about that cliff swallow with the 2,500 trips? Does that nest get reused?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would guess that those do get reused, and that is so. A lot of burrowing birds will reuse nests, although some burrowing birds will not. Like if you go out onto some of these offshore islands that are covered with like rhinoceros auklets and shearwaters and stuff, they'll dig a new burrow every year, and you go out on the island and it's just littered with thousands of burrows because they're being built. New ones are being built all the time, and then other species will use the abandoned ones that they don't build their own. So there's a whole thing going on there, but certainly cavities get reused all the time, and burrows get reused quite often. And I would assume those colonies of cliff swallows are being reused as well, or rebuilt, or repurposed and so forth.
Awesome. I think you got people interested in the decorating of nests. Can you expand upon any educated guesses about why species might decorate the outside of their nest?
Hold on a second. We write about it in here a little bit, the decoration stuff, but I can't recall off the top of my head why people think they do that. Ask me another question while I search for that, and
okay,
see if I can give you something.
You'll appreciate this one. Do squirrel nests ever look like bird nests?
Great. Yeah. So squirrel nests are often confused with bird nests. Well, a lot of squirrel nests are actually in trees, in cavities, or in the ground. But there are drays of gray squirrels in particular, that dray is the name for a squirrel nest, that are big, sticky, like lots of sticks and leaves and stuff. And for their size, that's roughly the size of something like a crow or a raven, but they're globular. and as opposed to like a cup nest like you'd see for a corvid. And so just for the size of the nest and being so enclosed, that's a good bet. That's what a squirrel looks like, as opposed to smaller birds that build globular nests that might be confusable with it, except for the size, or similar sized birds that don't build a nest quite like that. And just to come back to, as we write about decorative layers, there may be sometimes it's to help camouflage the nest. Some people thought that it may be helpful in some instances for attracting a mate. And I'm not speaking about, I don't know about particular species about that. I know that the style and structure of the nest for birds in other places besides North America has been shown to be very important for mate attraction. So that could be another possibility for decorations. So.
Awesome. And since you have the field guide in hand, Bindi wants to know, could you give a brief walkthrough on how to use the book to identify a found nest?
Great. Yeah. So the two ways that I always think about using field guides, one is before you go in the field, reading about the species that you think you might find there, so you know what to look for and where. So you might just make a list of species you find in your area, you'd expect to find in your area, read about them, and then go after it. In the front of the book, we have a bit of a key, which is, hold on a second. It's been a while since I've used the key myself. Of course, we put it, 1 second, page 11. Let me just show you guys this. So our key is just a series of basic descriptions of, I'm not going to be showing this really well. It's just giving, like, is the outer layer decorated with lichen flakes, right? Is it a very small cup nest? We'll give you these basic descriptions that I was talking about. So all you need to do is be like, oh, it's a small cup nest and it's found in a shrub. And then you'll just find that type of nest in here, the best description. And then we give you a whole list of species that make nests like that. And then you'd go through and look at the ones that are relevant for your area, if that makes sense. And that was really the best way we came up to do a key, was just to start with, we wanted to start with those basic observations that we knew everybody would be able to make, in a very basic way. And that's all the information I just gave you. So start with that, go to the key, find the description from, amongst these 20 or so options that best fits what you found. And then you can pick this, the species or types of birds that are listed as making nests like that fit your area, and go from there for the finer details. And then in the species account, it will say, look for this feature if it's this bird. They can, they'll attach their nest in this particular way, or they'll use this particular type of feature. They really like this particular habitat, or the inner cup is typically this big, so there'll be more detailed features for you to compare with the nest you found out there. I will say that while we were trying to figure out how to help people narrow things down before we came up with the structure that we've got in there, we created this whole list of, like, this dichotomous key, if it's this or that or this other thing, and they all at the end of it came back to, congratulations, you found a bird nest. So we decided that while that would really, I would enjoy having that in the book, we didn't think that the publisher would be super pleased with that. So we came up with the second option, which is what we did there.
People can write that one in themselves.
Exactly. But it speaks to my experience with this. Sometimes it's just really hard, you do all this work, and if I can narrow it down to 2 or 3 species, I'm feeling pretty good about myself for an old nest out of season, sometimes.
Yeah, that's super helpful.
Yeah.
Still got a few more questions if you're down to keep going, Dave.
Yeah.
Okay. This one asks, they check out tree cavities all the time, but they've never found one that's being used as an active nest. Do you have any tips for finding a cavity that is being used as a nest?
Well, yeah, I mean, during the nesting season, cavity nests are great because they're often up high in a tree, so they're not obscured by branches. Then you'll see birds flying back and forth to them. So it's really about watching the bird behavior rather than exploring the cavity. And certainly I would really strongly encourage people not to go peering into, if you're going to go peer into a nest peer into a cavity during nesting season in the spring, early summer, I would strongly encourage you to watch it for quite a while to make sure it's not being actively used before you go poking your head in there, just so as not to disturb the birds, for sure.
Awesome. This person asks, what can you say about great horned owl nests?
Great horned owls are pretty cool because they will nest in natural cavities, or they will nest in raven nests that are constructed by crows or ravens or red-tailed hawks. They don't build their own nests, which is true of all owls. I'm trying to just fact check myself on that. Pretty sure that's a true statement. And so it can be really varied, but they nest really early relative to other birds in their latitude. And in part, that may be, if you're going to nest in a red-tailed hawk nest, you need to get to the nest before the hawk does. And hawks will reuse their nest. Same with crows and ravens and things like that occasionally. So, yeah, so that may be part of why they do that.
Nice. Are there any species here in the Met How that it would be particularly useful to provide a birdhouse for?
Yeah, and I bet there's folks on this call that are more keyed into this than me, but obviously bluebird nests are really important for their cavity nesters, and wood ducks. There's a number of species that at this point are very dependent on human created cavities, kestrels as well. Yeah, if anybody else has a better line on particular cavity nesters that are really dependent at this point on human constructed cavities because of habitat changes we've made. Love to hear it.
Yeah. And follow-up question to that, Dave, does providing those nest boxes deter birds from using natural cavities, or?
No.
Yeah.
No, absolutely not. I mean, birds will use the best available cavity that they can find. And if there's a better natural cavity, I'm sure they'll use it. And if there's no natural the first project I had as a wildlife biologist, as a field tech, as a wildlife field tech, doing field biology, was studying Caspian terns. And Caspian terns nest on ephemeral sandbars at the mouths of rivers, which humans have essentially annihilated by channelizing river mouths to allow for shipping traffic. So finding quality habitat for them is next to impossible, except for these few human-created sandy areas, which is another story. But we found Caspian terns that were nesting on the tops of floating, like large industrial barges, and they were scraping together little piles of rust to make their scrape to lay their eggs on this iron platform. And floating in the sound, because that's all that was available to them, except for on the other side of this bay, this is in Tacoma, there's the Asarco Superfund site had plastic covering all this contaminated soil that was filled with heavy metals, and there were sandbags put down on top of this plastic to hold the plastic down, and some of the sandbags would bust open, and the terns would nest in that. And this is not because this is their preferred habitat, it's because what was available to them. If they had a beautiful ephemeral sandbar at the mouth of a river, they'd be there. So whatever we can do to create and protect habitat for nesting birds is great, but we should have no, I don't believe will deter them from using better quality habitat. That being said, if we are encouraging birds to nest or providing opportunities for birds to nest in places where there might not be structures for them to do that otherwise, we also have a responsibility to make sure that that is a safe place. So there's been research that's shown that while many birds will nest in suburban habitats, their survival rate is much lower, probably because there's a much higher rate of predators, which includes domestic cats and corvids and things like that, that hang out, crows and stuff that hang out around people. And so while we might be really excited to have nesting birds in those places, it doesn't necessarily mean that's a net benefit for the birds themselves. So a little bit of a complicated answer there, unfortunately.
Awesome. Thanks, Dave. Two more questions for you.
Yeah.
This one asks, do you recommend destroying house wren nests if you maintain bird houses around your home? I think they can kind of stack material in the nest boxes so that it's unusable for others.
Yeah, and they can also they'll go in and kill or destroy eggs of other birds, I believe, and nest in there. They're pretty aggressive. You know, I don't have a bunch of nest boxes, so that's not an ethical conundrum that I've got to deal with. I know there's folks in the valley here that manage lots of nest boxes, and I'm sure there's ethical guidelines for how to deal with that. Me personally, I probably wouldn't destroy a house wren's nest to make room for another bird, but I could be wrong about that. This isn't something I've had to deal with myself, as far as like the survival of other birds and how that relates to house wrens. House wrens are a native species here. It's not like they're not like starlings. Starlings is a different story. Starlings are also cavity nesters, and they wreak havoc on other cavity nesting birds. And I don't think there's any debate about the ethics of starlings and starling removal and so forth for other birds. But house wrens, I just don't know.
Awesome, thanks. And
Yeah.
final question, Dave, and this is more of kind of a searching question. So if you don't have an answer that comes to mind right away, no worries. But I was just curious if you think that if species that build their own nests versus ones that use pre-existing nests are like different in any way, or if they have any like common features, or they're more intelligent.
That's a great, I mean, there's some passerines, perching birds that don't build their own nests, that use other birds' nests. So evolutionarily, passerines are, more recent evolutionary phenomenon compared to birds that evolved a longer time ago that do build nests that aren't passerines. So I think that's hard to, I don't know that I could say anything about that definitively. It's complicated, which is the way nature likes it.
Awesome. Well, I think that's a great note to end on. Thanks to everybody for joining. And if you have any other nest questions, feel free to pass them on to me at daniel@methowconservancy.org, and I will do my best to get you some answers. But I also encourage you to go pick up the new Peterson Field Guide at Trails End Bookstore. I put a link at the top of the chat box if anybody wants to find it. So have a good night, everybody.
Bye all.